Hi, everyone. Welcome. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are. So pleased for everyone to be joining us today as we talk about non-human identities and whether or not they're the blind spot for 2025. For those who don't know me, I'm Doreen Reedus. I am one of the co-founders here at Cybersecurity Tribe. Before we really get into things and before I introduce my esteemed panel, just a few things around housekeeping here. So on the bottom right of your screen, you will see two options to ask questions to the speakers and one another. The chat function is an open function that permits everybody who's viewing this and in attendance to see, respond. And so a lot of times during these, there's dialogue going on when a speaker says something. The questions widget will direct those questions just to us, Paul, Olivia, and myself, and those I'll field at the end. And lastly, there is a handout widget, and there is a report in there that's been provided by our partner for today, and that's Entra Security, and you can download that at any point during today's discussion. Lastly, today's discussion is recorded, and you will get a copy of the recording in your inbox later on today. So with that, I'd like to introduce first Olivia Phillips. Olivia is the BISO at Amtrak. She's a dynamic executive leader with over 20 years of expertise in technology, cybersecurity, intelligence, and criminal investigations. She's an AI trailblazer. She's driven award-winning cybersecurity strategies and transformative advancements across both public and private sectors. She's renowned for her visionary leadership and technical mastery. Olivia continues to shape the future of cybersecurity through innovation and strategic excellence, and by joining us in things like this. So thank you, Olivia. Welcome.
Thank you.
Paul Carpenito is the CISO at ION Trading. A little bit about ION. They are a global market leader in providing innovative, high-performance, real-time solutions across multiple asset classes for electronic trading, position management, pricing, risk management, and downstream processing. Paul has 23 years technology experience, with 20 years of that spent in information tech security across a multitude of industries. He's the former head of information security with Lowe's Corporation. He has a master's of science from NYU Law, and he's also one of Cybersecurity Tribe's advisory board members. So thank you, Paul. He provides content frequently for us, and he's a U.S. InfraGard active member. So welcome, Paul.
Thank you.
And Itzik Alves. Itzik, thank you so much for joining us today. He is the co-founder of Entro. He started his cybersecurity journey 20 years ago with the elite IDF cyber unit. After spending 5 years there, he transitioned to industry roles, including cybersecurity manager, CISO for a major healthcare organization, and head of internal security and SRE at Microsoft. After being breached 3 times, he founded Entro to protect other organizations from those cyber breaches. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you.
So we're going to dive right in. Non-human identities, they've been around, right? But in the last year, we've seen a lot of press around them, a lot more discussions, I think because of breaches that have been newsworthy. And when I talk to CISOs, what's surprising to me is how many still say they're prioritizing their human identities over securing those non-human identities, when we know that on average, organizations have 92 times more non-human identities than human identities. Think about that, the massive amount of risk that's created there. Additionally, in IBM's cost of data breach report for 2024, they shared that breaches involving stolen or compromised credentials took the longest to identify and contain of any attack vector at almost 300 days. So that's significant. So today during this conversation, we're going to obviously talk about the concerns and the risks with non-human identities, but also, and the important part here, is the action that can be taken to help you secure them. So Olivia, if you're okay with it, well, even if you're not, I'm starting with you. So what I'd love to hear from you is a little bit about what the greatest frictions are in identifying and monitoring non-human identities in organizations.
Okay. So let me start off with how we talking from the industry standpoint, not from my employer standpoint. And going from that, it's lack of visibility and inventory of management. Organizations often struggle with identifying all and non-human identity, service accounts, APIs, IoT devices, and the cloud. And due to poor documentation and sprawl across the hybrid of multiple clouds has caused a lot of mismanagement and gaps with accounts and inventory. The other one is weak authentication and access controls. I know that it's a big thing. Sorry, I can't talk. Non-human identities still rely on credentials, hard-coded secrets, or shared accounts. Unlike human identities, and non-human identities often lack abductions, authentication. There's monitoring and behavioral, inconsistent governance and ownership. That is a big one. Compliance and least privileges are a big challenge for any organization, and securing machine-to-machine communication.
And Paul, do you see the same thing, or are there other concerns for you within your organization, or just from in general, I should say?
So I agree with Olivia's sentiments, and I'll say that the industry, by and large, suffers from the fact that we've gotten pretty good at identifying behavior from, let's say, human accounts, right? We could track things like impossible travel, anomalies, things that look out of the ordinary. But when it comes to machine identities or non-human identities, but let's bring it up just one level. Let's make sure we're talking about the same thing. So when we talk about non-human identities, we're talking about things like secrets management, secrets. We're talking about service accounts. We're talking about OAuth tokens, API tokens. But it's really hard to track or identify anomalous behavior when we're talking about non-human identity, right? Because they run 24/7. Not only that, they usually have a very high exposure to sensitive data because they're operating 24/7. They're usually involved in a process or moving data, backups, for instance. So it's really hard to track, anomalies and what looks out of the ordinary. And, as security professionals, we do try to apply the same rules that we do across the board, things like principles of zero trust, least privileged, but they're all disparate, all fragmented approaches to trying to solve this complicated problem. Also say that there's significant attacks, and threat actors know this, right? So they know how to attack non-human identities. Phishing is on the rise with OAuth tokens, right? Third-party engagement, sending users requests to install apps. And by the way, a lot of these accounts are overprivileged because no one knows how to privilege them. No one knows how to privilege them. Operations will typically privilege an account, and they tend to be overprivileged. And then you have the audit side. How do you track and monitor? And extremely low visibility.
Yeah, and a lot of these are not being monitored, right? And you don't know where they are. So the blind spot component to it is so critical. So if you could chime in here as well with what you're hearing, obviously from customers, but also we talk about them being a blind spot. We're hearing that it can be 300 days before these are detected. Can you shed some light on that?
Yeah, I think what you said earlier about for every human identity, there are 92 times non-human identities within an average organization. Like even the sheer size of them, it's insane, right? How can you identify all of them? Now, those non-human identities, those service accounts, API keys, connection strings, they are being created usually by developers, DevOps, SREs, without any proper security oversight or protocols. And they are scattering them around, right? They need to create them so the application can use them in order to authenticate against some sort of resource the application needs, like maybe a database. So they're creating them and they are storing them somewhere. So yeah, even to identify all of them, that's a huge issue. And then because those are being scattered around by the development teams, sometimes they are being stored in a public place that can be reached outside the organization. And if that's the case, going back to what you said about like the biggest or most important survey, IBM cost of data breach, saying, they're saying it will take on average more than 300 days, to identify such a breach. By the way, we've done our own research where we exposed a bunch of non-human identities. Usually those will be breached or used by an attacker within a few minutes. It's not a simple problem, and definitely we need to understand where are all of them.
So can I just interject for a moment? So the other side of that is there's issues with changing or rotating keys, right? Nobody rotates keys. Everybody's afraid to take
no one is doing that.
The account is running out of service to rotate a key. So the keys persist forever. The other side is offboarding, right? When a application or a service is decommissioned, is it properly being offboarded? Likely not. So it's sitting out there. You know, these are all significant exposures for organizations.
Right. But let me ask you that, Paul. Why do you think no one is rotating them or decommissioning them? Like, what do you think is the root cause of that?
You break something.
You break something, right?
And
there's an application. Exactly. There's an application that is using the token to access and authenticate against the database. And if you will rotate it, decommission it, maybe the application fail. But why are we afraid? Because we're lacking the context, we're lacking the visibility. We don't know which application are using them.
And you don't know who owns it, correct? Or who's managing them.
Exactly. Like who's the human owner? Even if I know which application is using it, who has permissions to do that. So yes, like getting an inventory in place and getting the right enrichment and context and classification around them, how they're being used, what's the data flow, that will probably solve, and it is solving, like we're seeing it in our customer base, that's solving the rotation and the decommission problem.
And we've seen that happen. I'm kind of going to go off script for a minute. And I know, Paul, I have a question for you. But Olivia, in a conversation we had not too long ago, we were talking about the fear of breaking something, if you will, or disrupting things, because you really don't know which of those non-human identities are being used and in which way. And if you do something, is it going to disrupt everything? And we've seen organizations make some errors there as well. Is that something that concerns you for overall for the industry? Again, I keep saying that because we know we don't want to focus on your current organization.
Yeah, from an industry standpoint, yes, that kind of keeps you up at night because you want to do your due diligence and making sure accounts that you know of are being changed and they are being secured, meeting, the 30-character passwords or whatever your policy states, depending on if you're following NIST or another industry standard. But that doesn't happen all the time. And then sometimes there's accounts where you don't know, and then all of a sudden where you're doing scans and you find these, you're like, oh, there's a 4-character password for a system. Why do we have this? And why can't we change it? And what will it take to change it? And then it becomes into a cost thing. Like, how much is it going to cost to change this? Because you got to see where it's hard coded at. Where is it connected? How is it going to affect it? And can I bring the system offline to change it? And sometimes that's not, you can't do that. Right. So you have to find other avenues and other workarounds.
Paul, I want to get into compliance challenges specific to non-human identity. Can you share your views on those compliance challenges?
Sure. I mean, by and large, the industry just does not know how to audit against non-human identities, right? And it's very common. It's very common for third-party auditors to look at, let's say, a sample of your service accounts, and that's only a very small representation of all of the accounts. And again, to Olivia's point, how do you tie that back to an owner? So they're never tied back to an owner. Auth keys, things like that, are never tied back to an application owner or a group, things like that. So it becomes very tricky to try to audit. And by the way, getting back to organizations that are significantly or have a significant risk factor, snowflake organizations, right, that rely on that service technology to run their business, that are mostly service account driven, they have a huge problem, tremendous exposure So it's a real big problem for the industry.
Yeah, I agree.
There's some good data. So if there's a report that CISA published, some real good and scary statistics by CISA, and it shows percentages of, I guess, executives who were queried over time about their thoughts about NHIs, and real good resource.
There's a good question that was dropped in the chat that I'd like to open up to the three of you. And Edward posted, aren't all non-human identities really connected to a human, right? At the end of the day, doesn't it come back to accountability? What are your views on that?
Sure. So okay, assuming that it does, or it did, or we do have a spreadsheet somewhere, and that's where it would exist, right? A living spreadsheet. Who updates it? The other thing is what happens when that person leaves the organization and data gets stale. So maybe you can do that with service accounts. You can't do that with API keys. You can't do that with things like OAuth tokens.
Correct. Well, it should be like that. Like every entity, everything should be attached to a human owner. But at the end of the day, again, like developers are creating them, not saying a word to anybody about that.
Everyone knows what happens with spreadsheets. When you have to update a common spreadsheet, everyone knows what happens.
Exactly. It's just super difficult to attach a non-human identity to a human owner. And exactly what happens when he leaves. Probably his manager is responsible for that. Who's making that connection?
And with 92 per human, it's hard to manage all that. It starts somewhere, but then where does it, as you guys have said, somebody leaves, ownership change. It could be a promotion and someone's no longer responsible. There's a variety of reasons that could impact that. I'm curious, and I'm going to ask Olivia and Paul this, because I mentioned that in recent discussions with CISOs, they have stated that they're still prioritizing the human identities over the non-human identities. And so when they're looking at budgets and investment, it's always going to human identities first. Knowing what we know, why is that? I'm truly curious why non-human identities have not been a significant focus for organizations to date. And I don't know if that comes down to a board understanding it or some other reason, but I'm curious if you guys have any insights or why you think that may have been in the past. Because I do think we'll see a shift. I do.
So I could opine, but just to close up the last question. So if you list your service accounts, API, if you list all of your tokens in one spot, you aggregate all that data, guess what you've done? You've provided a perfect list for threat actors to leverage and go hunt down high value, high target, high privileged accounts in your organization. And these are high privileged accounts. These aren't accounts that have low privileges. They're designed to run a service, connect to a third party. But Doreen, getting to your question, it's very hard to describe what a non-human identity is in context to leadership, right? And get that budget. So you're at a board meeting, very hard to describe what a non-human identity is and why it's a concern. So often as I said at the beginning of the discussion, we have disparate or fragmented tools to address some of the areas for non-human identities, but not holistically. So what that lends itself to is budgets getting offset to focus on one area because it provides a little bit of coverage, right? So there are tools for, let's say, secrets management, doesn't cover everything. Privilege access management doesn't truly address the problem that we're discussing here. But it's easier to put that in context in front of a board than it is something like non-human identity. Sorry, Olivia, you were saying?
Oh, no, I think it goes back to communication and the overall risk to the organization and presenting that picture, doing I guess I like to do the storytelling of explaining, hey, this is the risk. This is, the potential cost of that, of this risk if we get compromised, and having them understand it. But as you know, things are always changing. It's non-human identity right now. It could be something with AI, or it could be something, another threat within the organization. And I know it's always evolving.
Yeah, and I know you know more than anyone because you're an AI visionary, but AI attacking non-human identities is probably one of the larger issues right now as well. Yep. Two things. So first of all, just as a side note, we had a report released this morning. It's our State of the Industry report, and we asked CISOs and practitioners if they felt like a separate solution was needed for non-human identities. And there's a lot of information in that report, but every single one of them said yes. So that's why I think that we're going to start to see things shift over time. We did have someone ask a question that's not in the chat, so I won't name them, but it's a great question. And she says, why does it take, I won't say the word because we're recorded, blank hitting the fan before changes occur? What are some of your recommendations to bridge making these types of changes? And so the reason I'm addressing this now is we're obviously going to get into what are some of the actionable items. But I think when we talk about Paul saying like reporting to the board and it's harder for them to really understand what non-human identities are, how do you bridge that discussion? Do any of you have that?
Yeah, I think it's pretty easy nowadays. Like when I was a CISO, and that wasn't too long ago, what I've usually done is look at like IBM cost of data breach, Verizon reports, like the leading reports in the industry, Gartner and so forth, and looked at the most, the biggest attacks out there or the most devastating attacks. There it can be in terms of recurring attacks, or it can be costly attacks, or whatever you guys choose to do. Take the top 3, top 4, depends on my budget, and see what I have covered. So if phishing is the first one, do I have coverage for that? The second one, it's actually non-human identity. Do I have coverage for that? Going to your last question, I think that companies are prioritizing or used to prioritize human identities before non-human identities is because only recently, like 2-3 years ago, great solutions to protect non-human identities started to pop up in the market. There wasn't really a good solution that can give you an inventory classification, monitoring over them and so forth. So I just think it wasn't really easy to do so. And the ROI didn't make any sense. But now we see, an amazing trend that people are starting to prioritize non-human identities over human identities. And again, like it's being listed as the second most frequent attack vector out there. And that's how I used to prioritize stuff, and I used to communicate that to my board.
Yeah. I'm going to jump to some more questions that are being posted here. I feel confident answering one, but I'm not the expert. You guys are. So Edward again said, in a perfect world, would this become a role where a team could monitor and keep this updated and clean, a role for maintaining these identities? So my thoughts, and obviously I want to look to you guys, I'll start with you, Olivia, is that the manual process of doing that still leaves significant room for error. It's time consuming and costly, whereby automating it, and obviously that's where we can talk about Entro, would be the solution. But am I right? Olivia?
I think in a perfect world, it's having the perfect tool, having the perfect people behind the tool, and having the right people in place to monitor the tool and communicate what's going on. I mean, that's a perfect world for me, is everybody is aware of the situation, everybody knows what's going on, and there's a process of doing it. That's a perfect world for me.
Okay. Makes sense. Paul, anything different on that, or would you agree with Olivia's thoughts?
I agree. I think there are whole teams that should be dedicated towards identity management. So to answer the question directly, sure, there should be a role to maintain those identities.
I think there are already roles to maintain them. It can be application security, it can be IAM, depends on the organization, but I think like there are already people that are responsible for that. Whether they are doing great jobs or not probably depends on the tool that Olivia said, but people are already responsible for that.
I'm going to field one more thing in the chat, and then we're going to get into those action items. Keep asking your questions in the chat. I also know we have quite a few questions that came in separately. We will address them as well. But first question from Donnie, and then I want to proceed with action items. So how does the concept of non-human workers, such as AI agents or multi-agent systems, impact this problem? And what unique considerations does this create? Itzhak, can you take that?
Yeah, for sure. There are a lot of non-human identities out there, a lot of types. But at the end of the day, all of them are programmatic credentials that applications are using in order to access and authenticate against resources that application needs. And the application can be your internal finance application, or it can be an AI application, and so forth. And all of them needs to use some sort of resources like databases or storage accounts. When it comes to AI, it's a bit more complex because those programmatic access keys, those non-human identities, usually they have high permissions, right? They can access that database. They can probably update it or delete it and do stuff like that. So AI is also able in some scenarios to create new non-human identities, which contributes to the sprawl for sure. And in other cases, you can manipulate AI to do stuff for you where you don't have the permissions to do that, but the AI does. So the problem is twofold. It can either create more, or you can manipulate it to do stuff for you where you don't have the permissions to do so. You can solve them with monitoring, which is, again, not easy to do, but that's like NHIDR, non-human identity detection and response. That's the way to go about it.
Okay. And on that point, and it's some of the questions that are coming in through the question widget, we're going to address right here in this question that I have for you, which is obviously the most important component to the discussion is going to be that action plan. Folks are joining in because they know there's an issue. They know that it needs to be looked at. So how does a cybersecurity leader regain control of the non-human identities, right? One concern that we've heard, and we heard a little bit about this early on, is potential for business disruption. So can you share, Itzhak, how some of Entro customers have handled this?
Yeah, for sure. Again, going back to the problem, developers are the ones who are creating them, permissioning them, using them, and scattering them around. They are not really doing any security controls over them. And from a CISO or security professional standpoint, what they need to do is to understand, get an inventory in place, right? Understand how many I have and where they are. That's step number one. And then you need to enrich them. Usually those non-human identities are long read-only strings. And that means that even if you find one, what do you know about it, right? You don't know is the human owner, permissions, even if it's enabled or already expired. So you will need to enrich them. And once you have an inventory and you enriched everything, you know what they're being used for and how they're being used, then you can start doing security alerting or misconfiguration around them. Then you can start to understand how many of them are publicly exposed, how many of them have higher permissions than they need, how many of them have not been rotated in time. So do posture management over them, and then you should start monitoring them for any abnormal behaviors. Basically create some sort of bench line for each one of them to understand how they are being used, and then any deviation from that usage pattern should be considered as an abnormal behavior and maybe a potential breach. So I'll give an example. Let's say that you have a workload from the US that is using the token to access MongoDB, and now you're seeing connection out of China. That's an abnormal behavior. That's something you should probably prevent. And you can do that with the NHIDR, the non-human identity detection and response. And then after you have those active monitoring in place and have the posture management in place, then you can start doing some automation for remediation, like rotation, like moving them into a secured location, such as Vault, like removing idle and stale tokens that Paul talked about, and so forth.
So you hit on something I just want to drive home about. You mentioned the word exposure and these accounts. So one of the problems is we don't do a great job as an industry to identify what accounts have the most significant exposure, meaning that What kind of data are they handling? Are they internet facing? Do they interact with a third party who we're not really that comfortable with? Has the third party went through our TPRM assessment? So identifying the exposure is something that as security professionals, we really don't do with service account. We may understand the business impact, right? So a service account, let's say, fails to run. We know the business process that breaks, but we don't consider the exposure that's attached.
Correct. That's again, that's not easy to do. But if you have the inventory and if you have the enrichment, basically at enter the enrichment stage, it's a lineage map, so you know what devices, what workloads, what applications are using which non-human identity to access what resources, and if those devices or workloads are third-party apps, that's fine. We're going to show you that as well. But once you have the inventory in place and have the enrichment, you know all about that, and then again you can use that inventory, you can use that enrichment in order to conduct security, posture management.
And your alerting should align to that, right? Align to the
correct
accounts that have the highest exposure, where that
correct. Yeah, like exposure. By the way, when I said earlier it's the second most frequent attack vector, the root cause of that is exposed tokens, like developers that are sending them over Teams and Slack and within Confluence pages and committed into code and everywhere, right? Everywhere. So the root cause of that breach is basically exposure by developers.
Yeah.
Olivia, we had a question show up here, and I'm wondering if you're comfortable answering your views on it, which is and this is from Christo, when an unhuman identity is an app, right? For example, where would the accountability fall? So when working with a vendor, they work with their engineers to get the app functioning in your environment. Once it's working, then they're hands off. So who's accountable? Is it the vendor? Is it the engineer? Your developer now, who is now perhaps managing the app? What are your thoughts around that?
I think it depends on the contract you have with the vendor. I know, in several industries they have, for example, they have set up like, hey, if we run into account issues or if we run into a database issue or we need troubleshooting issues, the vendor has to provide support. But then it comes to the account who actually truly understands the account. If the vendor is maintaining or having access to that, their software, then it's on their responsibility. If it's basically handed to you and saying, hey, here's your application, here's everything, here's your account, now this is on you, then it's on the application owner to manage and know how that non-human identity is working and how it's connecting. Did I answer all that?
Yeah, that makes complete sense.
So I'll be devil's advocate, and I see Crystal asked a question in the chat, and I'll say that, how do you identify excessive permissions, right? How do you know what accounts have excessive permission? Let's say you do. Let's say you are able to identify excessive permissions. Who's going to be the one to turn the knob and turn that down or rein that in for the risk of breaking something?
Again, we're going back to the rotation. Like, why aren't we doing that? Because we lack visibility. That's why we're not doing that. You're afraid that if you're gonna right size a permission from admin to write or to read, something will break. But I'll let you know how we're doing that at Entro, and how we're giving the confidence you need in order to do that. Basically, what we're doing, we're enriching the permission. So we know there's a service account, an API key, and we know their permission. Let's say it's admin, okay? But then we're taking their activity, and we're saying that application is using the non-human identity with admin permission to read, only for read operations against the database. And we saw it for maybe 6 months or a year. All the application is doing is reading, but it hasn't been permission. I think you should have the confidence you need in order to push the button and right size those permissions. You can define it. You can say, I want it to be, 4 years, fine. or maybe 90 days, fine, whatever you decide. It's the problem that we don't have any enrichment and context around our NHIs, and if we do, then it's not an issue and we can do that. Who's accountable for that? The application owner, that again, Entro is enriching. But I have to disagree. Like when I was a CISO, yes, maybe the vendor is accountable for that, but at the end of the day, my organization will be breached, and that's why I'm also accountable and responsible for that.
But yeah, let me add to that. Is the other thing is I think it's communication and working with the engineers that you have on staff, your network engineers, as well as, you know, your operations, your whoever you have on hand, and working with the vendor saying, yes, we have admin rights or we have executive rights. This is what we have right now. Let's dwindle that and lock it down, such as the same as locking down ports and protocols.
Right. Yeah.
So we had a question come in that I swear it was written for you. You're going to be very excited to answer this. I know I had to make sure that he wasn't an employee of Entro, not. What products and services are most effective for security professionals to use to see and manage non-human identities and reduce risk with them? Welcome, Entro Security, to the chat.
Yeah.
Why don't you give a little bit of an overview of how you guys help your clients with this issue?
Yeah. So we're I've been a CISO, and afterwards I was responsible for the internal security at Microsoft, where we were breached by non-human identities twice, and I came into realization that I don't know how many non-human identities I have. The developers are creating them. I don't know their permissions. I don't know how they're being used. They are definitely not being rotated. And that's basically what we're solving in Entro. I truly believe that security teams needs better visibility over their non-human identity landscape. They need to understand how many they have. They need the right inventory in place. They need the right enrichment in place in order to actually manage them and protect them. So that's how we're starting. We have 6 pillars that helping organization to automate, secure the lifecycle of non-human identities. The very first one is inventory. Comprehensive inventory that will find all non-human identities wherever they are, even if they are only created and still in the resource. If they are vaulted, if they are exposed, we're going to find them and add them to the inventory. And then we're going to enrich each one of them, create a lineage map of which application is using the token to access what resources and other vital data around them, like the human owner, like the permissions, like activities, rotation times, everything you need to know to understand the blast radius of it. We're actually calling it an AirTag for your non-human identities. And then again, once you have the inventory and once you have the classification part, you can do share management, and that's the third pillar. Misconfiguration, static risk analysis around them, understanding their security gaps. So how many of them have not been rotated in a long time, how many of them have excessive privileges, and so forth, how many of them have not been rotated. And then we're doing the NHIDR, non-human identity detection and response, which is active monitoring over them, the abnormal behavior part. And then 5 and 6, we're doing remediation. So we're able to sync them to a secure location of the exposed one. We're able to streamline the rotation for you guys. And then the 6th one is basically offboarding, what Paul spoke about. Being able to offboard a token, disable, delete it once it's no longer in use. I'll share another statistic over here. When we're entering an environment, we usually see that about 40% out of all non-human identities are idle, stale. They are enabled, someone can use them, but no one is. And that means that on average, at least, you can decrease your attack surface by 40% like that. So that's the Entro platform. I encourage you guys to go into our website, Entro, entro.security. You have all of the data over there.
Fantastic. Thank you. That was a good overview. And obviously, as I noted, for everyone that's viewing, you can click the handouts in the apps widget, and there you can download a report from Entro. Paul, Olivia, Itzik, anything regarding non-human identity that we didn't touch on that you think is important to note or mention?
I don't have anything. I see some more questions in the chat. I don't know if you want to address some of the.
Yeah, I'm all about it. We have a few minutes, so let's do it. What's the difference between a non-human identity and a secret? And are they sometimes?
That's a great question. So non-human identities, those are the entities. You can think about them like the username for human identities. But non-human identities, those are the non-human entities. The permissions are over there, the activities are over there, and so forth. Secrets are the credentials of those non-human identities, and you can have different secrets, different credentials for the same non-human identity. That's actually how you're doing rotation. You are creating two credentials and then deleting the first one and starting to use the second one. That's a rotation. So non-human identity, it's basically the identity, the entity level with the permissions and everything, and then the secret is the credential of that entity. And that's what the secret is what application are actually using in order to authenticate against the resource.
Perfect. Thank you for explaining that.
Yeah.
Okay, so it looks like we've gotten everything addressed, everything we wanted to, all the questions answered, the handouts are available. We will be sending this recording to everyone who's participating and viewing, so you can share it with your colleagues as well. And I want to again thank Paul, Olivia, Itzik for joining me today, and of course, Entro for partnering with us to produce this today. Thank you all.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.